you're live. You might be live. You hope you're live. You think you're live. Your hair's a mess. Okay. The hat is crooked. I didn't really want to rush out this video so soon, but I already have another one kind of stacked up and ready to go almost. These other people put out so much content that it's impossible for me to keep up and watch the old stuff. At the same time, but a lot of their advice is redundant. I think I've mentioned this before, and as I want to mention almost at the beginning of all of these now, they do not classify their output in logical playlists for what should be including in videos about drafting your novel or your screenplay or your play, stage play, whatever, the writing stage, and the revision stage. So this is one of those pesky videos that, you know, they slip in that seems like it belongs in the writing stage, but also really belongs in the revision stage. I know some of you might think this belongs in the planning stage, and now certain elements of this could belong in the planning stage. And if you're a pantser, then some of this will happen organically, but all the second guessing you do afterward or during is technically revision, right? So there's that. So I have to skip the stuff that I kind of wanted to talk about that's fresh in my head to go back to the stuff that I didn't already record because I just put out a video 2 days ago or whatever. But in those 2 days, I was watching stuff. Now, I put good and bad endings as the generic thumbnail title because I can't always fit all the words in the thing. So the first part of this deals with good and bad book endings. And then the second half, oh, and where's my thing? Oh, I misplaced it. Where'd it go? Shoot. Okay, I was going to hold up my part 1 and part 2 card again. And I don't know where I put it. Might be here. Oh, yes, good. So for those of you who saw the other video where I very cleverly divided the thing into part 1. This is part 1. So if you don't want to sit through all of this part for some reason, even though they both kind of relate to each other, you can skip ahead to part 2. So another thing I'm trying to do to help you, the viewer, although I won't, again, be dividing these videos into subcategories, even though I'm complaining that they didn't divide theirs into subcategories, because I'm not going to put out 800 videos about this kind of thing and then let it be a free-for-all of redundant thoughts or whatever. I'm going to do these until I feel like I've covered it. And I don't know if we're halfway through or not. I don't know how many videos that might be, but I guarantee you that will not be the focus of this channel only going forward, because this is still a menswear channel mostly. But I don't have any new boots to talk about either. So for those of you who originally tuned in for boots, and somehow are watching this because you've decided you want to write a book or a movie, great. There will be boots again to talk about in the future, but we're also getting into the warmer months. So I'm not going to go on and on about why I'm not wearing that much boots, but might be a clue. Okay. So anyway, so in the first video, he kind of goes off in his tangents and primarily wants to be a comedian more and tell jokes to make the medicine go down easier with his spoonful of sugar, I guess. I'm less interested in doing that because I like to cut to the chase, because I know my videos run long and nobody makes it to the end. So, and here I've already talked for more than 4 minutes and haven't even gotten to the actual topic yet, but I promise the actual topic, I think, is stuff that we need to consider again while we're writing, but more while we're doing that second and third draft kind of thing. Okay, so he had said whatever he had said. I don't know. I don't recount everything that they say. I just try to go from memory based on my notes. But certain genres, you know, sort of require certain endings. So you're kind of having that as a starting point, even if you're not in typical screenplay fashion, coming up with your ending before you even start to write your beginning. That's, standard screenplay advice that some people follow and some people don't. Again, if that screenplay falls in a genre, you're kind of wedded to a certain type of climax and a certain type of ending anyway. Like if a romance novel ends in a horror scenario, all of a sudden, you might have few return readers or people who just read one bad review and never go to your film. I think what happens, why sometimes an ending or a book ending bogs down or goes nowhere, is that kind of denouement after the climax is, well, anticlimactic, for lack of a better word. And it's anticlimactic for a reason, because your climax already happened. That's your big Tom Cruise jumping out of the plane moment and saving the galaxy or whatever. Of course, what happens after that is kind of dull, even if it's a joke or a wink or, oh, he meets the president or whatever the deal is. Meeting the president after saving the world is kind of like, yeah, Forrest Gump, right? And then I went to the White House again, right? I've used that joke before, but I think it still fits. So yeah, not all stories have so much excitement for the climax either, as just, well, his examples were, they'll be obvious to some of you and not obvious to others of you. So I'll spell it out after I finish reading my note here. Not as much excitement for the climax as just seeing a bad word on a wall or looks in the mirror and feels the futility of life or whatever. I guess then it's the grouping of the words to end the book that's more important therein than the actual ending. And of course, the examples he used was Catcher in the Rye, which doesn't really have much of a ending. It kind of, all of a sudden you're in the dentist's chair, right? And then 1984, which I haven't read in years, but the big climax is the guy just says, look, you're fat and ugly and stupid, and go back to work, right? And I don't remember if they really punish him as such, other than this is his punishment, is to realize that he's nothing, he's nobody. Why did he ever think he would get that girl or whatever? Like I said, in a screenplay, we just typically start with knowing the ending, but not all fiction writers conform to this strategy, plot versus character, depending on your kind of focus, etc. So, I guess if you thought this was going to be me telling you how to make a good book ending, my notes kind of peter out there also. It doesn't really do that, but I like I said, I think he was saying a lot of books do have bad endings, and that I guess often we're just fine with that. I guess that's true to a certain degree. There was one person who said, well, sometimes the book and the movie end totally differently, like The Count of Monte Cristo, where the ending of the movie completely undermines the actual meaning of the ending of the book and that kind of thing. And so I guess if you watched the movie and then wrote your book report, you might get a poor grade. But obviously the old cliche is that no matter how the story ends in any other form in Hollywood, the happy ending wins. And that's just often true. So they do tend to butcher things that way. So if you are writing a screenplay and you want to have a down ending, I think it's more incumbent on you to have it be a good down ending that the studio might accept. Whereas if you're writing a novel, you're kind of subject to the whims of your editor, maybe in a different way. They might want the down ending for realism or whatever their motivation might be to agree with you. Yada, yada, yada. But again, I think the grouping of the words still has to be somewhat satisfying, that it didn't just end mid-sentence and the end, right? I don't know. Again, if you're writing in a particular genre, You're going to have to be a lot more cognizant of that than if you're just writing, I don't know, a standard book or a regular literature book, whatever the term is for that now, if there is one that isn't fantasy or horror or romance or detective. Well, detective. We typically, I don't read a lot of them because I don't get into that, but usually the reader is expected to do all the work to figure out who done it before the ending. So you're not supposed to be that shocked. I don't care. I like to let it wash over me. Oh, okay, it was that guy. Sure, I thought it was this chick. Whatever, or that kind of thing. If I have to spend all my time figuring out the clues, like, no, I have other things to do. I'm not trying to be a super sleuth. I'm just, reading this because someone told me to or whatever. So yeah, that. But again, if we don't solve the crime at the end, if we don't reveal the identity, then there is no ending. You're just, what? Instead, the protagonist gets killed, and like that would just not work for anybody ever, almost, right? Maybe you can try it and see how far you get with an editor. I don't know. Okay, so anyway, so like I said, if you have any questions on that part, put it in the comments. I don't, like I said, this isn't, there's no like how to necessarily write your book ending. That do what feels right, and then if somebody, your beta readers or your whoever has feedback, then maybe listen to that. But again, a lot of times that feedback goes kind of wrong because, as I mentioned before and mentioned again, the ending of Pretty in Pink, where again it was supposed to be this ending that was still a happy ending, but it wasn't a happy enough ending, so they changed it to this stupid ending that makes no sense 35 years later or whatever. Okay. Whoa. Okay. So switching gears slightly to something that is a little bit more useful, although caveat to the previous segment, if you're writing a series and not just a one-off, then these principles may apply more, that you will want a more open-ended thing and a hook that gets people to buy the next book in the series, right? So the 7 worst ways to end a chapter, not the entire book, but related, because there are bad ways to end a book. I think we agree. So in the timeline, let's see, this says intro, absolute worst ways versus reason to keep reading. 3 main types. 3, okay, we'll assume. So 1 is only, now I tried to categorize these into my own types. The 3 main types were mine, not his. And I'm not sure that I nailed it, okay? So that's why I'm a little bit kind of So only using cliffhangers. I put this as type B. I guess it could have been A since he put it first, but I think this other one is a little more prevalent, so I put that as type A. So the cliffhanger, if you use all cliffhangers, then the argument is that it becomes less and less surprising and therefore less and less effective. Except as the astute people in the comments that we'll get to in a minute point out, most of these are a variation of cliffhanger and fall. That's why I fall into category B. Okay. Category A, or type A, on the other hand, was have a character go to sleep. And this gives the reader, according to them, multiple video people, I'm sure, nothing to look forward to. And there's a lengthy comment that I'm going to read that covers this in a minute. Natural ending for a chapter and disagree below. Yeah, we're going to talk about that in a minute. And then type C, maybe. I'm not positive what. Type C was more of a catch-all at this point because, like I said, most of them were type A and then a couple of them were type B. Hence the thing. Is the dribble on chapter where it ends too late after the relevant action or whatever. But of course, we need that denouement in the end of our book. So maybe sometimes it feels natural to put some of it in our chapter. So he's now saying to cut the extra of that and hold it over for the next chapter, but I'm not sure that that's always necessarily going to be that interesting of a start of a chapter. And are they less likely to get bored at the end of a chapter and never pick up the book again, or at the beginning of a chapter and never, if the information is just not that interesting, I don't know that it's going to matter where you shove it. And this kind of goes back to the info dump versus the show versus tell and all that from the previous video, right? You can sort that out for yourself. Again, in the revision stage, I wouldn't be worrying about this too much in the writing stage. Because yet again, we have another guy who doesn't categorize these videos and just throws it out there. Because if you're writing your book and you're ending on all cliffhangers, and it doesn't matter because you're happily going on to the next chapter and being productive, then don't worry about it. When you give it to your critique partners and maybe subsequent beta readers, and they're going, oh my God, every single ending is a cliffhanger, it's exhausting, then maybe it's exhausting and change it, okay? Otherwise, if you're going and not having a problem with it and the readers aren't having a problem with it, then there's probably not a problem. Don't second guess your process too badly until, again, you get it to an editor and they go, no, we need to take away 3 of these cliffhangers or these dribble-ons, which they probably won't call it that, but they'll probably say, this chapter's going on too long. What if we move some of this to here? That's an easy fix when you get to that point, okay? Rather than, again, obsessing about it now when you haven't even written chapter 1 yet. Okay. Well, not now, but yeah, I'm generalizing. Okay. Better option that he offers is plot complication, although that's still happening after the relevant action. So I don't know. Memorable dialogue, again, happening after the action, though you're discussing the action, right? So hopefully you're not recapping. Hopefully you're not just summarizing what just actioned, but how this action affects what's going to come next. Yes, that's a very effective tip. Okay. A new message, which is basically memorable dialogue, but in a fax or a news report or something, a plot point. I don't know. Telegram. When is this novel set? I don't know. Email. A new arrival. I assume this is typically a new character being introduced, but maybe it's a character being reintroduced. Somebody from your prologue or whatever. So those are your tips from them. My tips, again, is yes and no. Like, again, obsess about it in draft 2 or 3 if you're going to. Otherwise, get the words on the page first. So then we got wrapping up the action. Now we're back to type A. End on some sort of beginning when the next stage of the plot starts. Oh, you mean like a cliffhanger, which was actually group B? Using too many cliffhangers. But still, he wasn't saying that the cliffhanger was ineffective. In fact, he was saying the cliffhanger was possibly the most effective, but not necessarily the most used, but possibly the most overused somehow when he just said they were the most effective. And then he turns around and says, do this, which is basically a cliffhanger, which he basically said was possibly overused. Okay. Again, the comments are going to get all into that. This is the fun part of the video that's only 20 minutes long. Then I add another 15 or 20 minutes to the end reading this other stuff that I think is relevant. So I should have a part 3 sticker, but I don't because it's all based on part 2. So yeah, we're at number 6 out of... Are we at 6? How many numbers are they? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I think there's 8. I think he said there was 7, but there's 8. I don't know. Whatever. So I should have little number cards to hold up for each of these. Resolving the tension, type A again, which now here we have what, the opposite of a cliffhanger. So instead of using too many cliffhangers, now we're going to do the opposite, but I'm still calling it type A just to. Oh no, because I had cliffhanger as B. Sorry. Correct. Yes, B is the cliffhanger. A is this, where you're doing not a cliffhanger, because basically these are the bad ones. Remember, these are the worst ways to end. So resolving the tension is bad, and so again, this is when you have, well, that denouement, but it overstays its welcome and does too much of its job. So, but here's where I had to draw the line on this, why I don't think it's always bad or ineffective, that it can resolve some of the tension or certain parts of the tension, if that makes sense. Like those books that have like a part A, part B, part C kind of thing. Usually movies, supposedly have a 3-act, but they just don't spell it out to you. Usually it's a fade out, and then it'll say like 8 years later, right? Well, books do that too. So if you've resolved or are seeming to have resolved that tension, and then we find out later, oh wait, still turns out there was this underlying animosity, that has never been addressed or whatever, I think that it's okay. You see what I'm saying? Especially if you're doing a whodunit, because then the person seems like they have no motive until we find out, oh wait, they had this motive all along that was way back in the teaser that we totally forgot about or whatever. Okay. So again, none of these are meant to be black and white, right? So the technique or strategy they offer is to take part of the beginning of the next chapter and move it back again. So instead of moving the other ending to the next chapter, now we're doing the opposite and moving some of that back. Again, that will be situational where that might work. Again, I think that's something that I think you're more likely to hear from an editor than necessarily always know when to do it yourself. And again, definitely not necessarily part of the initial draft writing process. So their example ends with arrival, like type C tip above, but somehow isn't a dribble on, and then more stuff added, which yes and no. Okay. The other thing that we don't really get into in these things is chapter length. Like when they're talking about ending the chapter badly, they're not necessarily saying because it goes on too long unless it feels like it goes on too long. So knowing how long a chapter should and shouldn't be can vary. I personally, you want to know why I stop and put down books a lot of the times is if I read a short chapter and I'm into it, but then I see that the next chapter is 30 pages long, that's usually more of a detriment than if there's another chapter and I'm still interested. So if your chapters are all like 5 or 10 pages, I'm more likely to read the next chapter just to say, oh, well, I can do 5 more pages. Fine. Then if I'm like, oh God, there's stuff that I want to read about, but all the interesting stuff has been thrown into this one chapter that, is going to take me 2 hours to get through maybe, or what if I'm interrupted or if I'm, reading slow for some reason because it's kind of dense and full of information and not a lot of dialogue or whatever usually seems to happen in those 20-page chapters where I'm like, okay, when 20 pages is kind of mild for some authors, it'll be 30 or 40, but sometimes there's that, usually the way they kind of group it is you'll have shorter ones and then all of a sudden you'll have this big one and that's your big climax. And then you'll have the little blurby one. And then sometimes that'll be in part 1 of the book and then there will still be a part 2 of the book. Or sometimes that's your big finale of the entire book, depending on how you've structured your book. So again, if you have a book that has like a part 1, a part 2, and a part 3, then okay, but know that the reader might get bogged down during any of those long bits, especially if they know it's okay. This is going to be an emotional journey. This is going to be a slog. This is going to be whatever, if your writing style is kind of slow and plodding to begin with, and now I've got more of it, even though this is the big climax, it's going to be like, oh God, I know this is going to be a chore. So few writers are, airy and breezy to get through those kind of bits, right? where it's 20 pages, but it's gonna go by. Don't worry, that doesn't happen as much as we would like. Usually it's those little short chapters that have a little breezy stuff in, like what was her favorite recipe? Oh, because her mom gave her this, blah blah blah. Okay, and before you know it, you're done, and all of a sudden, that's a literary thing. Blah. Okay, so anyway, redundant chapter endings, the next bit. I'm putting this also as type B, same as the cliffhanger issue. And basically we have no more type C, maybe, I guess. Although the next one might be kind of type C again. Summarizing through dialogue or reflecting on events we just read. Yes, as we just discussed 2 blurbs ago or whatever. In the same chapter, we've now put a description of the thing that just happened, instead of saving it for way later, which might be okay, but we might have already forgotten what happened by the time they get around to discussing it, depending on how your pacing goes and how your this and that plot is set up. Like sometimes it's kind of like you do have to discuss it immediately what happened, because that's how you get on to the next thing, like the whodunit or the spy thriller or whatever. We don't have a ton of time to reflect, but we do have to figure out who did that and why and where are they going next. And that's, the conversation that typically happens in that part so the audience can catch their breath. I'm speaking more of films, possibly because I don't read a lot of those kind of books. But yes, you do need some slow parts in books and films that aren't long, chunky, bogged down bits, but are info dumps, for lack of a better word. So we can get our bearings, so we can go, oh my God, okay, that was a lot. Tom Cruise jumped out of that plane, and how did he live? And da-da-da, Now where's, the bad guy, whatever. And of course, other books work on that principle too, because a romance novel, like it or not, the whole thing isn't just one steamy scene after another. If it's done correctly, there's an actual plot and a story still, I would hope. So then the last one here, dialogue without larger resonance. And so I don't know if this is type C or not, but whatever. So if you have this dialogue, but it doesn't do any of those things that we were just talking about, it has no weight, it has no significance, it doesn't communicate the theme or provide any subtext or blah blah blah. Okay, so I think like I said, I think I spoke to that to a fair amount already. But some of this is more philosophical than plot driven, right? And I mentioned this maybe in a previous video, but this was something that I had noticed in a couple of movies. And so I'll throw this in here, even though it's not necessarily a chapter ending thing. Often it's just in the middle of a scene, it's just sort of allowed to happen. And I think it's meant to give character description without, like, I don't know, mindset stuff. There was one movie where, like, 2 guys had, I think it was a whodunit. I don't remember exactly, but for some reason, the one guy is talking to the other guy, and they just start talking about Bob Ross and making a joke about how much he painted. And it, like, literally had nothing to do with the story whatsoever. I think it was just supposed to be like a Pulp Fiction moment where we're seeing these 2 guys having this goofy conversation, ha ha ha, and they were wishing it was a Tarantino movie or something. But oddly enough, that's the only, like, I don't remember what movie it was. That's the only part of the movie I remember, so I'm kind of glad that it was in there, because I can remember it and go, hey, that was funny. What the hell movie was that? But on the other hand, like, it did absolutely nothing to do anything for the plot, and it wasn't the end of the scene, though, that I recall. Whereas something like that, again, you'd think it might be the end of the scene, like he's saying, but not necessarily. The other one, I think it was the beginning of a scene, but don't hold me to that. But there were a bunch of people, they were kind of trailer park people, and they were complaining that a woman had thrown away the junky bits at the bottom of the potato bag or potato chip bag or the cereal box or something. And they were saying, that's the best stuff. And of course, anybody who, I don't know, lived in my era always thought that was the worst part, not the best part. So why they flipped it, I don't know. Again, couldn't tell you what movie that was, couldn't tell you anything about that movie, couldn't tell you why that scene was in there. But I don't recall that as being the beginning or the end of the scene, just random. Okay, so going back to, okay, so this is, I'm not even apologizing. Okay, so we're at 30 minutes, but now I'm reading other people's comments that I think are relevant. Okay, and this is not gonna lie. This thread goes on for a while. Okay. And so this is other people's words, but my opinions may or may not jibe with theirs. But as promised, okay, so Hootie B, whatever, I don't know. I'm not gonna read their names because I don't care. The funniest thing about this advice is that as a reader, these are all the things that drive me insane. I want the chapter to wrap up so I can start fresh with a new chapter. Again, kind of agree a lot of the times. I think a lot of this is current zeitgeist more than necessarily automatically great writing advice. So again, if your editor's not going to publish you unless you do all these cliffhangers or don't do all these cliffhangers, then maybe play the game. But when you're writing it, write it the way you want to write it. I hate when they end without resolution because either I have to stay up and read the next one, which if it's at night and my brain is fried and my eyes hurt, I'm not going to actually absorb what I'm reading anyway. And if I do have to stop because my eyes are now bleeding from reading for hours on end, I'm going to forget where we left off when the next chapter starts. I'm old school and hate, capitalized, stopping reading mid-chapter. So I tend to finish whichever chapter I'm on when my eyes start to hurt, no matter how it ends. Same. Like, yeah. Like I said, if there's a little short, little bitty chapter and then a big long thing, I'm not doing that big long thing tonight. I might never finish the book. Sucks to be you if you're hoping that I care. She goes on, though. I'm assuming this is a she. I think it was a she. I don't know. If the story is intriguing, the writing good, and the characters engaging, you can end a chapter with anything, and I'm going to want to finish the book. Yeah, probably. I feel like all this end a chapter with the reader wanting to keep going all night is just baiting. If a book is really good, I don't want to binge read it. I want to savor every word. I don't want to rush to the finish line. I want to enjoy the ride. If a story is written to get reviews about the shocking twists and couldn't put it downs, then yeah, this is all great advice. Yeah, I mostly agree with that, except when I was in, I think it was 8th grade, I had a teacher who said, no, when you're reading for pleasure, read as fast as you can. And if the book's not any good, throw it away and get another one. Which is great if you had a bunch of extra money lying around to just buy random books, I guess, or you bought them cheap like I did at the used store. But typically when I'm reading for pleasure, I'm not reading all that fast. When I'm reading something that's semi for pleasure, but it's like I said, something I feel like I'm supposed to have read or should read, I'm not as invested in this, but then again, I'm less likely to finish it either if I don't read it fast because once it starts to bog down, I'm like, I guess Robinson Crusoe wasn't that, essential after all, and I still haven't finished it, right? So and that one's not even long like Monte Cristo. Although I did recently pick up I found a copy of Don Quixote, and I had read the first 4 chapters of that 30 years ago or something, and I might attempt it again soon and see how far I get. Okay, so then another guy here. Now we get into the ones that I copied because they're more funny. King, blah, B, blah, blah, blah. Anyone remember Quantum Leap? After doing whatever he'd have to do in a given leap, he'd leap out into the next person, and we'd see maybe 15 seconds of whatever tense situation he just arrived in. That show excelled at ending a chapter with a beginning. Yes, but it also gave us that break part before the jump happened. So we did have a little time to reflect. And that was more a teaser for next week. So you didn't have to watch the teaser if you didn't want to, or if you didn't want to stick around through the commercials maybe or whatever. You could have clocked out already and picked it up next week. And most of the quantum leaps, if memory serves, weren't stacked on each other where you had to see each episode sequentially to know what's going on. in terms of the overall plot, because I don't think I ever saw every single episode of that show. And anytime I tuned in until maybe toward the end when they were starting to try to wrap up some of these mystery pieces of why the show existed in the first place, then all of a sudden maybe it became important who Hal was or whatever, his backstory and all that. But prior to that, the only one I remember is that Hal was a prisoner of war at one point. Kat says, while I agree that going to bed is generally a terrible way to end a chapter, I do think there's one exception. Going to bed angry. If your POV character has had some sort of a fight and there's continued unresolved tension, either with another character or within themselves, I think this is an appropriate ending if used sparingly. And that's a nice twist. I agree with that. Although I think the character going to bed because they're genuinely tired can work, because then you can have a jarring beginning of the next chapter when they're rudely awakened. Fire, you know, The Hobbit, they did that, right? Or Lord of the Rings, something like that. Don't quote me on that, but use that as a possible example. Golden, to me, a chapter ending with going to sleep is nice since it kind of gives me a break from reading. So if I feel like reading more, I'll continue. And if I've had enough reading, I'll stop and continue another time. Yeah, same. I'm kind of indifferent to whether or not the character goes to bed or not. If I just started the book and that happens in chapter 3, I'm probably going to read chapter 4, maybe even chapter 5, again, depending on the length of the chapters. If he goes to sleep and then the next chapter is really super long, then I might skip and wait for later. If he goes to bed and then the next chapter is short, well, okay, what happens in the next chapter? Is it related to what happens the next morning? Or is it some, subplot with other characters or something? We'll see. Because again, that's a thing you can do, is change from this narrative to this narrative as part of your story, and they don't have to be the same chapter and make the chapter way too long and stuff that's not related to each other. Okay, again, that's a little more of a writing strategy than a revision strategy, but then when you go to revise it, if you find that you've put everything but the kitchen sink in this one chapter and realize, hey, if I could just break this up into smaller chapters, that might be a better way to go. Unintended mango. I don't know if there's really more than 5,000 of them, in which case it's less original than it sounds. Good point. I was just rereading one of my favorite stories, and there's this chapter where two characters have this very difficult, emotionally charged conversation about awful things that happened in the past. The conversation ends with a general acceptance that there's nothing either of them can do about it, and the POV character ends up alone, curled up in bed in a room that isn't his, trying not to cry. It can be a little boring to read a chapter that ends with something like, the day's over, so the POV character will go to sleep, I guess. But if you can complicate the scenario by highlighting or re-emphasizing events that just happened, that suddenly becomes interesting, because it's no longer an arbitrary ending. It's a continuing part of your plot. Take that as you will. Eddie says, John collapsed onto the bed in his hotel room and fell asleep. Just kidding, he died. Crystal said, taking this, thanks. Okay. And then 5G says, should have kept that a secret, my dude. On the other hand, it's been done to death. So they're just trying to be funny, and I'm reading it for you, in case you never ever read it for yourself. Okay. Then Cass here has opinion, but is also not published, right? I assume. I don't agree about the going to sleep one. If I know that the next day the character is going to be doing something I really want to see, seeing the character with them going to sleep does absolutely nothing to stop me from wanting to dive into the next chapter. Yes, but again, depends on what your editor says, right? I also think authors need to stop being so afraid of the reader putting the book down and giving them a good stopping point. Definitely agree. Most readers are not capable of reading a whole book in one sitting. Yeah, when I was younger, there was a few that I would, get all excited and Thanksgiving weekend reread them for a couple of years there, maybe, because I knew I was bored and it was Friday night and nobody was doing anything, or Thursday night or whatever, or actually the night before Thanksgiving is Wednesday night. So any of those 3 nights, I might have read an entire book for a couple of years there in the chair by the fire. when I was feeling bookish and the weather was crap. Okay, but other than that, I don't usually read a book in one sitting either. No, especially if it's a longer book that's more than 200 and 250 pages. And I know I can do it in 6 hours if I really, 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 really power through it. And again, might not enjoy it at the second half anywhere near as much as I should. But if I'm awake, animated, know I have this time to kill, and want to power through once in a while. Your goal should be giving them an interesting enough story that they want to press play again as soon as they can. I don't need my readers to stay up all night reading my book. Again, most of us don't, because you have kids or you have a job or something. Don't feel bad that you can't read a whole. I met a woman just the other day who said her current strategy schedule is a book a month. And the average length of the book was probably about 300 pages. A month, not a night, a month. Okay. I'm perfectly fine with them putting it down, going to sleep, and then picking it up again the next night. And even by the next night, I might have forgotten what happened yesterday, but hopefully I haven't forgotten all the characters' names. Also, for what it's worth, I have never, but if I read the book all in one night, I don't remember it any better than I would have if I read it in chunks, because I'm just forgetting more of it sooner, right? Because I'm not clocking it into my long-term memory typically anymore. Also, for what it's worth, I have never been hesitant to end my chapters at a point that feels like a conclusive ending and a satisfying place to press pause. Again, this person is probably not published, but whatever. And yet I still have been told countless times from readers that they devoured my books, the typo there, in one sitting or stayed up all night because they couldn't put it down. Well, lucky you. Okay, we don't know who these readers are or how relevant that is. But this person then replies to them, Ashish. Yes, I also had similar thoughts at some points, and thanks for articulating them so well. I think a lot of the advice in this video stems from the popularity of page turners and binge reads that make almost all aspiring writers to aim for those. My favorite books are typically the ones that don't mind me closing the book, but keep my mind churning over them, typically finished over days and weeks instead of a 2-day binge. Very good. And then Just Claude replies to the first one, not the second. I like when books give me space to step back and breathe. I like to end chapters at natural transition points. The reader can take a break and come back later easily slip back in. So yes, thank you, Claude. But then Cass comes back and replies to Claude, but not the other one. Totally. We shouldn't be so afraid of giving the reader a stopping point. If the book is good, they will come back and finish it after they've taken a break. This is a natural process of reading a book. Books aren't movies. They aren't meant to be consumed in one sitting. A lot of movies are too long, too. But we don't get as many of the epics as they used to in the old days. But again, if you've written this book and you're happy with all these chapter endings and your editor tells you no way, no day, then you might have to rethink some of that. Martakis, whatever. I totally agree with you, especially if it's first person or third person limited narration. Going to sleep and thinking about what happened, what they had just experienced seemed natural. Again, it depends on the story. Like a romance story, maybe a whodunit. Typically a horror story, you're not going to have time to sleep much unless it's a really traumatizing thing and they're knocked unconscious, in which case, again, in a film, we typically get that fade to black and then it restarts. But usually that's the end of an act, not the end of every chapter. So it has to be kind of a big deal for that to be your stopping point. Okay, so let's clarify that. That it won't work in every genre and yada, yada, yada. Okay. But again, going to sleep is a human thing. So when these people are telling you that your book should have human emotions in them to get the characters invested by the readers and blah, blah, blah. Well, yes, if they're so exhausted or whatever, or they need it, then you are probably in the same place with them to some degree emotionally, or you wouldn't be invested in the story or the character at all. And so it's much better than forced cliffhangers or cutting the scene/dialogue in half. I don't think that he was saying to cut the actual dialogue in half per se, I want to clarify that as well. So here's your Easter eggs. You're not cutting them off mid-sentence and then continuing the dialogue in the next chapter. You might morph your dialogue into conversations with the same characters about the same thing as a technique that makes more sense. Now, the thread keeps going, and I didn't cut and paste any more of it. Okay, but this is on the same time. I don't think this is from that same thread. Author SE. Okay. My biggest pet peeve is the fake cliffhanger. When a chapter ends with suddenly there was a blood-curdling scream, and then the next chapter opens with clumsy Aunt Jane toddling into the room and saying, "Oops, I accidentally stepped on the cat. There's no problem." I've seen a lot of that in cozy mysteries, which is part of why I mostly don't read those. Ugh. And again, yeah, horror movies do this a lot when that first shocking moment is nothing and it's just a joke to jolt your senses and has nothing to do with the plot. That can be kind of annoying. I haven't read these cozy mysteries so much, so not my problem. I don't mind cliffhangers, even a lot of them, so long as they're actually meaningful and they're paid off in the next scene. I feel like the author cheated just to trick me into turning the page. I want to throw the book across the room. Yeah, exactly. And again, sometimes in a horror movie or other movie, well, Romancing the Stone's one that does that, but the movie is mostly comedy but has suspense elements. So when the phone first rings and she's and the cat, and it's just, you know, what, like, it's fine, I guess, but the whole movie doesn't keep always doing that, but it does do some of those non-payoffs for comical reasons rather than this, you know, cottage grandma deal. Dangualo. Next morning when I woke up, I was dead. I hate when that happens. Unless you're a cockroach, right? Then you die later. I find the worst. Oh, sorry. Rigzag. Did I read this right? I find the worst way to end a chapter is in the middle of a cent. You get enough cents and you got $1 even if you don't have any common. Okay. Vig Night Room. I don't know if I'm reading Moon. I think this is Moon. I've only had a character fall asleep at the end of a chapter once, but there were numerous reasons for it. It was a natural conclusion to that chapter. It's a breather for both the character and the audience, as the character had a massive bombshell revelation dropped on him, and he had a difficult choice to make come morning, so there was still an expectation for excitement in the next chapter. Is that 3 or 2? That was 2. The character is in a dream/nightmare world, so there was a sense of irony falling asleep there. That's not what irony means, but okay, I see what you're saying. The next chapter is set up so neither of the character nor the audience knows if it's a dream or not until the end. Falling asleep in the previous chapter is the perfect setup to get the audience wondering what's real and what isn't. Yeah, and there was movies that kind of did that, like with the Arnold Schwarzenegger one with the Running Man or whatever. Or no, that's the other. I'm thinking of the wrong title, but it doesn't matter. And Dreamscape, if you ever saw Dreamscape, that was a little bit more easy to figure out what the dream sequences were. They kind of introduced most of them instead of just jumping us into them, but I think there was 1 or 2 where they just kind of jumped us into them. I don't think I've ever put a book down because a character falls asleep to end a chapter. I've actually read stories where this is exciting. Again, anything done well is done well, right? Ever read a good horror story where the protagonist has to stay awake and struggles? One of my favorite short stories has a scene break close enough to a chapter ending where the protagonist had to stare down a threat to live or he'll be kidnapped and eaten and failed. Like I said, that's usually a big scenario, though, where we're fading to black kind of thing. Okay. So you're not doing that at the end of the chapter 1 just to end chapter 1. Okay. It made the twist of how he survived that much more satisfying. The author made it seem like he was in bed where the threat would come for him, but after the scene break, it was revealed he actually placed a decoy in the bed and watched from the closet. The twist would not have worked as well without the tension of the character falling asleep. There you go. Okay, but if you're doing that, then you're stealing somebody else's idea and not being original. So now you've read somebody else's idea of what a good idea was from somebody else's idea. Mirma, I don't know. I hate reading books that have zero good stopping points. Sometimes I need to put the book down, and not having any chapters that don't feel like a good stopping points defeats the point of having chapters for me. I use them as stopping points. Yeah, sometimes. Keith, I'm a bit confused. The solution to 6 of your points was essentially to add curiosity, but one of your points was to avoid too many cliffhangers. What's the difference between adding curiosity and a cliffhanger? And then Samara says, that's a good question. That's a great question. I hope he answers it. Yes, they typically don't answer these kind of questions in these kind of comments, which is why I'm still reading this stuff. Because, like I said, a lot of these are not necessarily hypocritical advice, but a little pat, a little black and white. Ryan says, my interpretation is the difference between a TV show that constantly tells you you need to tune in next week to discover who did what and for how many cookies versus leaving at a place where you left thinking about the events and proceeding the end of the chapter without the stereotypical leading cliffhanger. And then, awesome run-on sentence, Ryan. Anyway, I might be missing the point entirely, so fingers crossed that your question is addressed. So that was me addressing Ryan, I guess. That probably doesn't happen either. Did I don't know. So then the next video, which should be part 3, part 3. This is going to be much shorter. I said it was 2 parts at the beginning, but I guess it's 3 parts. And that's not going to help because we're already at 50 minutes, but whatever. Intro. Don't lose readers. Most are plot or character strategies, but he doesn't say this in the intro and saves for number 10 for no reason, really. For no real reason, sorry. I had a second bit where there was a comments guy. Should I just save this for another video? Or should I keep going? I guess I'll keep going. I'm going to try and read it fast. Okay. But I was skipping ahead to comments guy here because, again, same as the previous video, this first guy says, what? They only talk about cliffhangers, then proceeds to tell you 10 different ways to use cliffhangers. So yeah, same as the last video, almost as expected, but this was a separate video. So this guy puts different guy, that was Wikimon and then Pear Pack, whatever. So it's all about setting up a promise for the next chapter. All is lost. End of one path, start of something new. 2, level up, a new expectation. 3, foreshadowing, a new feeling. 4, starting an argument, a new conflict. 5, show an epiphany, a new idea. 6, end on a first time, a new situation. 7, counterintuitive reaction to, a new idea. 8, a firm decision / a new direction. 9, beginning the action, a new situation. 10, impart wisdom, a promise of value. Okay, so yes, so my rebuttal to this point by point, even though okay, this is going to be redundant, but it's almost there. We're almost there. So in the intro of the 10 practical ways to end the chapter, as opposed to those 7 bad ways or 8 bad ways or whatever it was, don't lose readers. The intro is... here is his techniques. Again, worrying about the page turner people more than the engaged reader, I guess, or the emotionally engaged reader. Most are plot or character strategies, but he doesn't say this in intro and saves for number 10. No, for no real reason. Okay, so we'll get to that in a minute. 1. All is lost. Terrible news. Sour event. Reader wants to see how character will react to such news that has been introduced at the end of this chapter and make them want to go to the next chapter. 2. Leveling up. The character has experienced some triumph as opposed to the opposite, where usually we do get the opposite. That's the whole point of the frustration, is making us want to see how they overcome the frustration. This time they've overcome the frustration, or part of the frustration. So I've never really heard this one before, but then he uses Slumdog Millionaire as an example, which I have not seen. But apparently it's not exactly a cliffhanger. 3, foreshadowing anticipation. So like a cliffhanger, again, but this time we're dealing with terrible danger instead of just a mild concern example, similar to that grandma thing, except that was the start of a chapter instead of the end of one. 4, an argument starting an argument, that is so more unresolved tension that carries over somehow. That doesn't seem disjointed, supposedly. Therein, again, the rub. A revision kind of thing more than a writing thing, maybe. Sounds like actual argument already ended in his example, though, just because the feelings that the characters retain don't change. Again, that buried motive thing that I was talking about way back when. 5, show an epiphany. So this is not a cliffhanger nor a foreshadowing. The character has a new insight, and then we're going to explore that in the next chapter. Again, I think that's technically a cliffhanger or foreshadowing. 6, end on a first time. Sounds like another cliffhanger, but also sort of like leveling up because we have growth and change. So he's a little bit redundant here, sort of. Splitting hairs, maybe. Where am I at? 7. Counterintuitive reaction. So this is the opposite reaction to what the reader might expect. And he gave some example there that I don't remember. But again, it's not supposed to be the anti-cliffhanger with the grandma, right? It better be some decent payoff, even if it's the sad ending instead of the happy ending or whatever. Or the character, the revelation is not the revelation you expected they were going to have. Like, hey, this girl really doesn't like me. I should give up and pursue this other girl. Instead, I'm going to follow this one until she calls the police. Like that kind of, I don't know, which again is the difference between a romance and a rom-com, right? Because the typical complaints you hear about Hallmark movies is, you know, at what point does this become unrealistic? And a modern gal would never trust this guy or whatever, when really she's dating the guy that she can't trust because he's the scoundrel, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, where are we at? 9. Firm decision. This being the cousin of having an epiphany. So again, we're splitting hairs. Like sort of cliffhanger, but also foreshadowing again, but it's a turning point in the narrative, which should be almost any chapter ending to a degree. Although again, you can have those bigger endings that are the book 1, book 2, book 3 endings, where that's a little more thing you're going to do, maybe to hook them into the next book. But some books, again, they cut you off cold and then they go off onto this whole other story and then they tie it again at the end later. So it doesn't necessarily follow that convention either. So again, it kind of depends on the story you're writing and the type of story you're writing and if we're changing main characters or not. 10. Beginning the action. Again, more counterintuitive, related to that previous. Sounds lame to me. The example he used was somebody had re-adapted Huckleberry Finn with their own counter narrative or adjacent scenes or whatever. And so he says that at the end of this chapter, a guy tells Jim to run, and so Jim starts running. I don't remember if that ever happens in Huckleberry Finn, that they meet some random guy in the bushes and Jim runs away. because I haven't read that book in years, more than years. But I'm assuming that that's supposed to make us want to follow Jim on his action quest. But we've just introduced this other new character. For some reason, we're not following that character instead. I don't know. Again, I don't know what this book is about, because if you're going to have other characters, then it should be their story instead of you just doing new stuff with somebody else's characters, I would think. So I'm not really sure where to go with that. Did I miscount these? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yes, I did miscount these. So we're back at 10. That was 9. This is not 11. Whatever, if you're scrolling, this is the last bit. So it doesn't really matter if my hands are doing the wrong signals for the people who are scrolling. Impart wisdom. So here I was going to go off on a bit more of a tirade. I think I might have addressed this in the previous video or 2 videos ago. I forget which. He wasn't addressing preachy soapbox books, which are, kind of propaganda or fables without a moral. But I was just thinking about this last night, about how people would say putting a moral at the end of a morality play would be lame and audiences would complain or groan. But then movies have actually been doing this now for at least a decade already. Although these are typically mediocre movies where they want to beat you over the head with the message instead of just having the message, or the message is the excuse for the movie instead of the characters or the plot or whatever. He gives a more philosophical example, I suppose. A book that teaches something about how to live well, but less preachy or pedantic or sanctimonious, we hope. Not exactly like the same as Epiphany or Level Up or that other one, whatever number 9 was. Firm Decision, or no. Yeah, it wasn't counterintuitive. Yeah, Firm Decision. Did I? So yeah, so that went on and on and on. I went way on and on and on. And that was really long. So I'm not necessarily countermanding all of his advice is automatically bad. That's not the point of this. This is definitely not an episode I think anybody's going to watch all the way through all at once either. Same as a book, but an hour, okay, whatever. I've been to lectures with instructors that are 2 hours. So if you can't make it through an hour, you maybe didn't want to learn anything anyway. And like I said, reading those other people's comments is what really took longer than just reading my own. But at least I can prove that other people have these thoughts and I'm not just talking in a vacuum about nonsense. So that's part of the reason to include that. So again, if you have any cause for concern or need for more clarity, leave me a comment in the section and we'll try and fix that up for you. And again, if you haven't already, get started on that first draft sooner than later, and hope that works out for you. And if you're in the revision stage, then hopefully this will be more helpful than if you're in that stage. So if you're in the draft writing stage and you're watching this going, what is he talking about? Yeah, come back and watch this in 6 months or whatever. Or go back and watch some of my earlier videos that might be more relevant.